Last year, around November, a church I used to work at did a tour to Israel. And they brought me along because they like me and a poor church planter, so they felt bad for me. So they brought me along and they took me to Jerusalem and all over, the different places in the Holy Land. And one of the places we visited was actually Mount Carmel. Like the scene that the video was just talking about, where we're looking at today. I actually brought some pictures. If you can see, that's a view from the mountain. Like the mountain that we're reading about, that's a view from the mountain. They have like a little chapel in there. There's actually like a statue of Elijah holding a knife. It's kind of like representing the event. Like the story that we're about to hear happens right there. It's actually not that big of a place. And it means a lot to me personally because God spoke to me in that place. I was kind of like having to make this very important decision in my life. And through that story, through a story that we're about to read actually, God spoke to me. So when the people from CIY say, hey, this is the text that we're looking at, I get actually super excited because God has used it in my life. And my hope tonight is that God will speak into your lives too. So before we kind of like jump into the story, would you guys mind praying with me real quick? God, we step into this moment and we believe that you're here and we believe that you want to speak to us. We believe that you're not far away, but you're close. And that when we open our hearts and our minds to your word, to what you have to say, we're able to hear you. And God, my desire is that I have, all these new friends in this room who need to hear from you. So God, may they not hear from me or from my insight into the text, but may they hear from you of the incredible love that you have for them. God, may you speak a new word into their lives tonight. God, may the meditation of my heart and the words of my mouth be pleasing to you. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. So, as you read the story, Elijah has been kind of having this face-off with King Ahab for 3 years. It hasn't rained. All sorts of things have happened. And at the end of these 3 years, Elijah is like, enough. We're going to end this now. Like, people are starving. There's no food. We need the rain. And the way in which things is going to change, the way in which God is going to send the rain again, is we're going to have a good old-fashioned showdown at the top of the mountain, and we're going to see who's who. So that's kind of like the story that we jump in. So let's actually just jump into the story. Let's read it, and then let's see what God has to say to us. So this is where the story starts. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21. Elijah, he's talked to Ahab and challenged him. And now he's talking not only to Ahab, but he's talking to all the people of Israel. Let's imagine we're the people of Israel and I'm Elijah. He gathers everybody around and kind of gives his speech. And he says, Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. This is kind of how the text starts. Now, one thing that probably it's helpful for us to understand is when you read about idolatry in the Old Testament, we read so many texts, in the book of Exodus, the people of Israel had the golden calf and all these other gods and whatnot. When you read about idolatry, it's not like the people of Israel had completely sworn off God and walked away from God and then just started worshiping Baal or whatever other gods. It was more like the people of Israel worshiped God, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, and they worshiped Baal, and they worshiped this other God, and they worshiped these other guys. They were kind of playing the field, for lack of a better term, right? So they were worshiping all these different gods all the time. And what Elijah is saying, you cannot keep doing this thing that you go from one god to the next and back to the other. You have to decide who you're going to worship, right? So then the story keeps going. Verse 22. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, And I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. What's going on is that Elijah is saying, I'm going to prove to you once and for all one thing. That the God of Israel, Yahweh, the God that we see in the scriptures, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he's a real deal. He's a true God. And your gods are not. And I'm setting up the most insane thing that you can possibly say. Because if you hear about it, it's kind of crazy what he's actually telling them to do, right? He's like, we're going to basically, make this sacrifice, kill this big animal, put it in the center of the mountain, and then we're going to pray and ask for fire to come down. First of all, I don't want to be around that. And if I am, I want like the fire department to be like right next to me, right? But second, it's crazy. Like, it's an insane request that he's making, but the people go with it. And it's fascinating. And Elijah is so convinced of two things. He's convinced that Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is a real God. And he's convinced that Baal, the God of these other guys, is not real. And that's the only way that he has, the bravery, the boldness to make this proposition, right? Just to keep reading, verse 25 says, Elijah said to the people of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us. They shouted, but there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he's a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought or busy or traveling. It's the equivalent today of saying, hey, maybe he's like checking his Instagram account. He doesn't have a time to reply to you, right? Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears as was their custom until their blood flowed. Elijah now gets bold. He starts taunting them. In the original language that the Bible was written, when he says perhaps he's busy, that's like a euphemism for perhaps he's in the toilet. Which, by the way, rude. Like somebody's in the toilet, don't bother them. But anyway, the point is your guy is clearly not replying to you, right? And then he keeps going, and now they basically give up because nothing happens, right? Verse 29, midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 sheaves of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. Do it again, he said. And they did it again. Do it a 3rd time, he ordered. And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. What's going on here is that Elijah is setting up the sacrifice, right? And the prophets of Baal have been like basically the whole morning trying to get fire to come from heaven and nothing happens. So Elijah says, okay, enough of this. Like, it's my turn now, right? So he comes up, he sets up the sacrifice, and then he starts pouring water into the sacrifice, which sounds like a really bizarre thing to do. And what's going on here is that Elijah is trying to say, I'm going to make it incredibly hard for this sacrifice to catch on fire. Which sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? Except, let me ask you this. Have you ever been challenged by a younger sibling to do something, and you knew that you can crush the little brat like a peanut, but he keeps like taunting you, and you're like, okay, right? So like maybe, I'm faster than you, right? So like, okay, let's do this. I'm going to go all the way back there. You get like in the middle, and let's see who gets there first. Because you know you're going to beat them. That's what's going on here. Elijah said, okay, I'm going to make it so difficult for this sacrifice to catch on fire that you're going to know that if it catches on fire, it wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It had to be God. I'm going to prove once and for all how superior God is to Baal, how more powerful he is, right? And then the story keeps going. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me. So these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away. This is a story. Elijah, after 3 years of this drought that's going on, because the people of Israel have walked away from the true God, challenges Ahab and challenges the prophets of the false God to a showdown. They set up in the mountain, and Yahweh, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's the God who wins. And He wins in such a, convincing way. The fire comes down and basically like burns everything down. It's so powerful. And the people of Israel, who up until that time had been kind of like going back and forth, like, yeah, we like Yahweh, but yeah, we like Baal. They have no choice but to just fall on their knees and recognize that the Lord was the real God. Now, what can that story possibly have to do with us in the middle of Tennessee in 2019? What's the story really about? The story is about this tension that existed in the life of Israel between the worship of the one true God and the worship of false gods like Baal. And you're going to say, well, Joel, that's cool, but we don't worship other gods, right? It's not like there's like a Satanist CIY at like 3 p.m. that we hit up on the next time and then we come to this one, right? Like, it's not like, we do like a version of, another religion of this thing, or like that we go to different temples or different religions during the week. And I might say you're right, like that's true. But the funny thing is that when you read the Bible, the idea of idols, the idea of what Baal is, it's not only just like a statue that you worship, but an idol usually represents something, some elemental force of nature, some elemental force of life that people think is more important than God. So for example, Baal was the god of thunder. Baal represented power. So for the people of Israel, well, obviously, we want whoever the most powerful God is. But there were other gods. There were gods to money. There were gods to sex. There were gods to all sorts of other things. And I would argue that today, we have our modern day version of idols. They might not be like statues that we build and we have like a shrine or we go to a service to worship. But there are things in our lives that take the place of God. And let me tell you this, a lot of times they are not bad things. Actually, the funny thing about life and the world is that God has created everything. So all that idols are good things that God has made that have been corrupted by the devil. So there are things in our lives that are good and should be important to us, but we make them too important to us. Let me just throw an example out there. Let's say that you're a really good athlete and you're really popular and people like you because of how good of an athlete you are. And if I were to take a look at how you spend your week, the majority of the time of your week you spend on doing this thing. And if I was to ask you, what's the thing that you think about the most? You probably would tell me, well, it's my next race or my next game or my next whatever. Sometimes it's not being an athlete. Sometimes it might be a relationship. Maybe somebody in your life that's a good thing, that loves you and that cares for you, but there's a moment that it can become too important. And the opinion of that person matters more than the opinion of anybody else. And if that person is not in good terms with you, then your world just feels like it's falling apart, and it just occupies so much of your thought and so much of your mind. It might not be that. It might be something more simple as just like your popularity. And being popular becomes the most important thing, and being liked by people becomes the most important thing. And none of these things in and of themselves are bad, are they? Being an athlete is good. Sports are good. You know, having relationships, good relationships, healthy relationships are good. Being a nice person who people like is a good thing, right? It's better than being a mean person who nobody likes. But if those things become the most important thing in our hearts, if those things become like the most consuming thing, like the thing that they become the thing that we think is going to make us happy. If I keep winning, and if I keep scoring, or if I keep saving, or whatever my role is, if I keep doing that, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to feel joy. If this person keeps liking me, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to feel joy. I'm putting my trust for my future, of my well-being, into this thing. That's what an idol is. And this is the thing, in the Bible, you're going to see over and over and over again, is that God cannot abide idols. Not because God is insecure, but because God knows the dirty secret about idols. And the dirty secret about idols is that idols will eventually turn on you. Let me take you back to the story that we were reading. There's a scene in the story that I think is very interesting, when the prophets of Baal are praying to Baal or crying out to Baal, and Baal is not responding. And it's interesting what they do. If you go to verse 28, it says, so they shouted louder, and listen to this, and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. The prophets of the false god, the prophets of the idol, apparently were used to the idol not responding to them. And the very next thing to do when the idol wasn't responding to them was to hurt themselves. If you keep reading, verse 39 says, midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But listen to this. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. This is the thing. When we make anything other than God the most important thing in our lives, that thing is eventually going to disappoint us. Because it cannot provide the joy and the fulfillment that can only be found in God. When we make anything other than God the most important thing in our lives, it's eventually going to let us down. That's why God is so against idols. Because He knows that they're going to hurt you. If you're an athlete and you make that the most important thing in your life, what happens when you get hurt and you can't play anymore? Or what happens when you're thinking, okay, I'm really, really good at this because I'm going to do a scholarship and I'm going to go to college, and this thing that I'm good at is going to be the ticket for the rest of my life. What happens when you don't get the scholarship? What happens when you've put so much of your time and your energy and your emotion into this person, and things are great right now, but when that person for some reason decides that they don't want to be with you anymore, that you're not as interesting to them anymore for whatever reason, then the next thing that comes is the feeling of just being crushed and lost and lonely. That's idols turning on you. And it will be, and I can fill the blank with anything. Academics, popularity, whatever it is. That's what happens. Whenever we make something, anything, other than God, the most important thing in our life, the thing that we believe is going to give us joy and fulfillment and happiness, eventually that thing is going to turn on us. It's going to crush us. And this is the other interesting thing. For most of us, it's really hard to recognize when that's happening because we do what the Israelites did, right? It's not like we stopped going to church, and it's not like we stopped doing things like this or volunteering in youth ministry or, reading your Bible or praying. We do those things still. The problem is that at the same time that we're doing these things and we're singing these songs about how God is worthy than any other being in the universe, we still make the source of our joy and the thing that deserves the most of our time and the most of our effort and the most of our tears, something other than God. We live in this kind of in-between world. When I was in 5th grade, there was this girl that I really, really liked. And we were just friends. And one day I'm just sitting on my desk, and somebody sends me a note. And you have to understand, I come from an age where we didn't have cell phones in 5th grade, so we wrote paper notes with messages to one another that were passed throughout the class. And I get this note, and it was from her, and it was basically it's 5th grade, so you're kind of it's like, hey, I like you, do you like me back? And I'm like, is this am I getting punked? Is it a prank? What's going on here? And listen, I kid you not. The very same day, I get another note from another girl who, listen. I get another note from another girl. Thank you. I peaked in 5th grade. Okay, that's as good as I ever got. And I get this note from another girl, also telling me that she liked me, right? And here's 5th grade me, looking at my desk at these notes, and I'm like, I wonder if there's a way that I can respond yes to both of these notes. Listen, I did not do it. No. It was a thought. I am not proud of it. I have repented. The Lord has forgiven me. I did not do it. But I think about it often because I think that's what we do with God. It's not like we don't believe in God. It's not even like we don't love God. I really think, I don't know your lives, but I remember being your age and I sincerely loved Jesus. I sincerely did. But there were all these other things in my life that I also loved. And I thought that these things were also going to make me happy. And a lot of times I had to choose between Jesus and these other things. I ended up choosing these other things. And I ended up suffering the consequences of that. Listen, I think that what's going on is that it's easier a lot of times to trust in idols than to trust in God. Because a lot of times we can see the little hit that the idol gives us right away. You can see the Instagram likes. You can experience the popularity of getting text messages from everybody all the time. You can hear the applause when you win. When people write about you, when people say, hey, you were great last week, that's awesome. We can hear, and we hear those things, and they become so evident, so close, that it's so easier for us to trust in them, except that at some point, if we put more of our trust in those things, they're eventually going to let us down. There's this Christian writer named Andy Crouch, and he has this book about power, and he has this paragraph about idols that I love. He says this. He says, all idols begin by offering great things for a very small price. All idols then fail more and more consistently to deliver on the original promises. He's saying at some point, at the beginning, it's great and you're popular and you love it, and then you need a little bit more and a little bit more to feel the same way. Then he says, while ratcheting up their demands, which initially seemed so reasonable for worship and sacrifice, in the end, they failed completely. Even as I make categorical demands. In the memorable phrase of the psychiatrist Jeffrey Satinover, idols ask for more and more while giving less and less until eventually they demand everything and give nothing. Or maybe you know what I'm talking about, or maybe you know of someone that represents it. Somebody whose this thing was like the most important thing. And when that thing got taken away, it crushed them. And what God doesn't want for the people of Israel back in the day, and what God doesn't want for us today, is for our idols to crush us. So what Elijah does is Elijah sets up this showdown with the prophets of Baal because he wants them to prove the real God is the one who you can trust. And God sends fire from heaven to prove that He's real and to prove that He can be trusted. And you're listening to this and you may say, well, cool. Are you going to make fire from heaven fall down right now so we can believe that God is a real God? And I checked with our insurance policy and we can't do it, so sorry guys. No, this is the thing. When you read the rest of the scriptures, the rest of the Bible, what you see is that even after God sending the fire to prove that He could be trusted, the people of Israel still walk away from Him and still go after their idols. So ultimately what God decides to do is to not just send fire from heaven to prove that He was real, but to come down Himself. The story of Jesus is the story of God coming down Himself into the world to prove that He's real, to prove that He loves us, and to prove that He can be trusted. And the reason why from that day on we're not asking God to send fire from heaven is because God can't top that. That's like the biggest thing that God can do. Sending His own Son into the world to live a perfect, sinless life and to eventually be arrested and be crucified for us. God can't do that. And then to raise Him from the dead on the third day. God can't top that. That's like the ultimate display of power and the ultimate display of love. So the question for you and for me tonight is, do we believe that that story is true? Do we believe that that story that for the last 2,000 years has been passed on from generation to generation to generation, that you've probably heard repeatedly in your classes and in church and with your friends and in your small groups, do you believe that that story is true? Now listen, if that story is true, then we are at the exact same moment that the people of Israel found themselves right after the fire came down from heaven. If the story of Jesus is true, if we believe that Jesus is who He says He was, and that He died on a cross, and that He rose from the dead, then we're at the same place that the people of Israel found themselves after fire came down from heaven, and we have a choice to make. And we have a choice to make on whether we trust God above all other things or not. Now listen, for some of you, you may never have had actually put your trust in God for the very first time. I mean, you're actually in the place that you don't know if Jesus is even real. And you've heard about these things, and maybe your friend invited you, and you have a decision to make. And I'm sure that there's people that you came with in your group that would love to talk to you about this and tell you the story of this Jesus. But I would say that for a lot of us here too, we believe in Jesus. And we believe that the story of Jesus is true. And we believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that he died and that he rose from the dead. But we're still looking at all these other things as the most important things in our lives. And when we look at how we spend our time, when we look at how we spend our energy, when we look at what we look to for happiness, it's usually something other than Jesus. And what I don't want, and what God doesn't want, is for that thing to turn on you and crush you and disappoint you and let you down. So today, the invitation for you is to look towards Jesus first. And to stop, the imagery in the book of Hebrews is like to stop wobbling between two branches. Elijah was saying, you're going in the God branch and in the Baal branch. And the invitation for you is to stop doing that. And to decide to follow Jesus. Now listen, for some of you, when you hear this, your fear is that if you put your trust in Jesus, that somehow Jesus is going to let you down. And what I say to you tonight is, he doesn't. And the evidence that he doesn't is that he gave his life for you. Years later, there was this guy named Paul who was one of like the early leaders of the church, and he's writing to this church in Rome, and he's trying to explain this to them. He's saying, you understand, if Jesus is who he says he is, if God sent Jesus, then we have nothing to fear. So he reads to them and he says this, in Romans chapter 8, verse 31, he says, what then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Paul is saying the proof that you can trust in God, the proof that you can trust in Jesus, is the story of Jesus giving his life for you on the cross. And you know what's interesting? In the story that we just read, when the prophets of Baal don't hear from their God, what do? They cut themselves. They make themselves bleed in hopes that their God would pay attention to them. In this story, Jesus gives himself up for us. Jesus offers up his body. Jesus lets himself be tortured and crucified so that we would trust that he loves us. That's why this God is better than Baal. That's why I trust in this story better than the other story. That's why I put my trust in Jesus before I put my trust in anything else, because I believe that he's willing to do that for me. And the question for you tonight is, do you believe that he did that for you? And if the answer is yes, that's it. I want to close to this. I want to invite you to do something. My similar strange. Would you close your eyes with me for a second? In that passage in Romans I just started reading, the Apostle Paul keeps going because he wants them to know how much they can trust God. So he says this. He says, who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Listen to this. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, or hardship, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. Then he goes on, he says, no. In all these things, we're more than conquerors through him who loved us. And then he says this, he says, for I am convinced, I am absolutely sure, that neither death, nor life, neither angels, nor demons, neither the present, nor the future, nor any powers, neither height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. God can be trusted. God can be trusted because God is real. And you have a choice to make tonight on who you're going to put your trust.